Follow the science. Trust the experts. Do as you're told. These are the orders that were passed down on high from politicians, public health officials, faceless bureaucrats. They promised if we complied, if we followed the rules, if we did what we were told, they could keep us safe. But they didn't keep us safe. They fed us a story that over time just raised more and more questions. Where did the virus come from? How was it created? What role did the US government have in financing dangerous gain-of-function research? What don't they want us to know? What else aren't they telling us? Just asking these questions got you labeled a crank or a conspiracy theorist. And when that didn't work, they started censoring us. What were they so actively trying to hide?
I think there's probably never before been a cover-up in our country so fully exposed.
The gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
You do not know what you are talking about.
The NIH did fund gain-of-function research.
It is inconceivable that I was trying to cover up the possibility of a lab leak.
I saw it in this book.
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to.
We know that under the stars and stripes, we have more freedom than do civilized people on Earth.
Strongest force for freedom and democracy.
We will defend our freedom.
Freedom of religion and speech.
Freedom of speech.
Donald Trump is not censored.
Are you censoring people?
No.
Conservatives have been whining and whining and whining.
And this has been debunked.
Far-right conspiracy.
Disinformation.
Disinformation. Boy, that's a familiar term.
Twitter has been sold to Elon Musk.
In the words of Elon Musk, here we go.
Twitter file.
Elon Musk's release of the Twitter file.
Thousands of internal documents.
Mostly a protest.
The most secure in U.S. history.
Safe, highly effective.
Evidence of collusion.
Science and the truth are being attacked.
One of the biggest clues we got that there was a cover-up was in 2018, there was a project called Diffuse, and it was proposed by the Wuhan lab.
Burner phones, hand-delivered packages.
Sounds like international espionage. I've referred him to the Department of Justice 3 times.
Is Anthony Fauci a made man?
He certainly seems to be protected. I mean, is there a deep state? You're damn right there's a deep state.
It's time to pull back the curtain on the cover-up. First time we talked, you pointed out that the explosion in funding for this kind of pandemic research happened in conjunction right after 9/11.
We appreciate your calling this hearing and giving us, my colleagues and I, the opportunity to address the threat of smallpox bioterrorism and how we may, as a group, defend against the bioterrorist potential of this pathogen.
Much of that, an increase in budget, if any, did you receive after the September 11th related, or I should say the anthrax attacks last year?
Well, the budget process as it evolves took place following the September the 11th and anthrax attacks in the fall.
We have a chart from the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. It was $2.5 billion in 2002. When we look at fiscal year proposed for 2003, we're $4.4 billion.
Right, correct.
So almost doubled.
And it sort of put me down this path that this isn't just a failed government response to a dangerous pandemic. There's something much bigger going on.
Over the course of the last 2 decades, the U.S. government and other governments, I'm sure, undertook this project to try to find the pathogens in the wild places of the world, bring them into labs, essentially weaponize them, turn them into pathogens that can actually infect human cells, and potentially even be spread from human to human.
The virus came out of an intentional research program. That intentional research program says, let's go to the wild places, find viruses and other pathogens, bring them into labs inside big cities, mutate them, add functionality to them to see if they might be able to infect others. And the reason you do that is that if you have a virus that has only a few mutations away from that capacity, you can develop vaccines early, you can develop countermeasures early. The risk is that the lab worker gets infected accidentally. They go home, they spread it to their wife, they spread it to their community members, and it spreads everywhere. A virus that never would have existed in nature only exists because we did this research, then is spread to the community elsewhere. So gain of function is a scientific experiment. You take a virus or some pathogen, let's say a virus, and you mutate it. Gain of function is a scientific experiment to ask, how much do we need to change this sequence so that it will infect humans?
And to be clear, gain of function could weaponize a virus that wouldn't have an affinity to infect humans and be devastating should it leak. I forget what year it was, but Fauci actually wrote an article defending gain-of-function research, I think in response to the Obama prohibition. And there's sort of a creepy sentence in here where, like, yes, a leak is possible, but the benefits obviously outweigh the costs.
Bioterror there's always the potential for bioterror. And we have a major biodefense research and development efforts. From the NIH, the CDC has surveillance mechanisms, Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense. We do all of that. Having said that, the worst bioterrorist is nature itself. Nature is very good at evolving microbes to create problems. You have to have some restrictions in the sense of you don't do work that could actually hurt people, in the sense of if you have a laboratory accident, you have to have the right containment. Once you start being too restrictive, you then impede creativity for so many of the good things that could come out of the same type of work.
From Jeremy Farrar, the theory of the origin of the virus has gathered considerable momentum, not just in social media, but increasingly among some scientists in mainstream media and among politicians. We hope to focus the discussion on the science, not on any conspiracy, and to lay down a respected statement to frame whatever debate goes on before that debate gets out of hand with potentially hugely damaging ramifications. From Marion, and I would leave LabEscape for the discussion, because putting that in the public domain as a hypothesis, in my view, will be read as, see, they also thought so.
And they organized a small number of members, of very powerful members of the scientific community, to essentially say that, to parrot that, and make it look like it was the independent members of the scientific community saying that, rather than Tony Fauci organizing this, or Farrar of the Wellcome Trust organizing this. It was an independent set of scientists who were like, oh, it's natural origin.
Our main work over the last couple of weeks has been focused on trying to disprove any type of lab theory, but we are at a crossroad where the scientific evidence isn't conclusive enough to say that we have high confidence in any of the three main theories considered. From the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2, the scientific article written by this group of scientists organized by Anthony Fauci. However, since we observed all notable SARS-CoV-2 features in related coronaviruses in nature, we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible.
Let's say that you're Tony Fauci and you know you've been funding this gain-of-function work or this kind of like, let's bring viruses from the wild into population centers and labs and experiment with them. And you funded this lab in Wuhan, exactly the place where this outbreak happens, very close to the lab itself. It's January 2020, maybe late December 2019. What you do is you organize a group of people that you fund to absolve you. Say, oh no, it's not a lab leak. It must have come from the market.
From Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust to Francis Collins and Tony Fauci. On a spectrum, if 0 is nature and 100 is release, I am honestly at a 50.
Millions and millions of people have died. Economies have been devastated. The poor of the world, children, vulnerable people have been hurt by this mad science experiment. I mean, that would be, you go down in history as one of the world's greatest monsters.
When I first asked him about, did you fund gain-of-function research, we presented him with the name of the paper, with the name and number from his agency at NIH saying he funded it. I would have thought he would have said, yes, we funded this, and we didn't realize how dangerous it would be. Instead, it was the absolute, denial.
Scientists in the U.S. have long known how to mutate animal viruses to infect humans. For years, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a virologist in the U.S., has been collaborating with Dr. Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Virology Institute, sharing his discoveries about how to create superviruses. This gain-of-function research has been funded by the NIH. Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research.
So I was surprised at that. I thought he would just own up to it. But I think from the beginning he knew that if he wasn't successful with the cover-up, that he would go down in history as having funded and supported research that led to a worldwide pandemic, killing maybe 15 to 20 million people. That's an extraordinary thing to be remembered for, and I think that will be his punishment in history.
Did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth?
Yes, we did. Research that goes on in many, many labs around the country. It is not regulated. And the reason it's not regulated is it poses no threat or harm to anybody.
We came back about 3 weeks later and we had more evidence and we wanted to re-bring this up. And we reminded him from the outset that it's a felony to lie to Congress, and do you want to retract those words?
Section 1001 of the U.S. Criminal Code creates a felony and a 5-year penalty for lying to Congress. On your last trip to our committee on May 11th, you stated that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And yet, gain-of-function research was done entirely in the Wuhan Institute by Dr. Shi and was funded by the NIH. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the Wuhan Virology paper entitled Discovery of a Rich Gene Pool of Bat SARS-Related Coronaviruses. In this paper, she took 2 bat coronavirus genes, spike genes, and combined them with a SARS-related backbone to create new viruses that are not found in nature. These lab-created viruses were then shown to replicate in humans. Viruses that in nature only infect animals were manipulated in the Wuhan lab to gain the function of infecting humans. This research fits the definition of the research that the NIH said was subject to the pause in 2014 to 2017, a pause in funding on gain of function. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain of function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans, right. You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly, and I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. You get one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
Lying in front of Congress is a felony that would quickly land any ordinary citizen in prison. So I'm forced to wonder, why has Dr. Fauci faced no consequences for his actions?
We've referred him. I've referred him to the Department of Justice 3 times. We've detailed his lies to Congress, which are a felony, and I've sort of tragically and jokingly said if he were a member of the Trump administration, he'd have been arrested long ago, because I think we have 2 standards of justice. One of the amazing things, though, if you look at people online, when I bring these things up, the response will be, well, how come you just talk about it? All you do is talk about it. It's like, well, I'm not with the Department of Justice. I would arrest him. I would prosecute him. I don't have that power. But it's funny how the frustration across America, a lot of people are frustrated and they want you to, well, how come you don't do anything? And it's like, well, I am doing things. I'm trying to do oversight. I'm trying to look at the information. I'm trying to expose it. But I don't have prosecutorial power. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They're like, why aren't you putting him in jail? It's like, it's not for lack of trying. I've referred him 3 times to the Department of Justice. He certainly seems to be protected. I think the Democrats, the reason the Democrats, I think, coalesced around him is that he represents government, and they think government is the answer to most things. And I think they don't want any attack on him as an attack on central planning or attack on government. But there's probably never been a guy that's been more protected in a way. He received a $1 million prize while he was still a bureaucrat. He was being paid more than the president. He's being paid $450,000 a year. His wife gets over $200,000 a year. Together, they make about $800,000 a year. That's pretty good bureaucrat work, as far as I'm concerned. Robert Kennedy wrote a lot about the intersection between Anthony Fauci's funding and the biological weapons research that's going on, and how his budget became 100-fold bigger after 9/11. You know how 9/11 caused a lot of overreaction? One of the overreactions was to give Anthony Fauci more money and allow him more power and more ability to get involved in biological weapons. I think he pretends to be a public health official, and he would never even probably acknowledge the other part of it. But this is a guy who makes frequent trips to Langley to visit the CIA.
According to information gathered by the Select Subcommittee, Dr. Anthony Fauci, then director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, played a role in the Central Intelligence Agency's review of the origins of COVID-19.
This is a guy who is, in all likelihood, conversant with weapon systems that we still don't even know of. You know, we voted unanimously in the Senate and in the House to declassify all the material and release it to the public. Almost nothing happened from that. There was a short little snippet that the Biden administration put forward that revealed nothing. Most of the information I've been trying to get for the last 3 years is already declassified. We've got nothing. But when we start looking into defense agencies, we get less than nothing. The accusation is that 7 scientists were convened and they were asked the question, as they were in every intelligence agency, look at the intelligence and what is your conclusion? Do you think this, with what degree of confidence, do you think this came from nature or from the lab? FBI said moderate confidence, we think it came from the lab.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan.
DOE, either low or moderate confidence also. CIA The initial vote, the whistleblower says, was 6-1, saying that it actually came from the lab.
According to the whistleblower, at the end of its review, 6 of the 7 members of the team believed the intelligence and science were sufficient to make a low-confidence assessment that COVID-19 originated from a laboratory in Wuhan, China,
and that they were overruled by senior CIA officials.
The whistleblower further contends that to come to the eventual public determination of uncertainty, the other 6 members were given a significant monetary incentive to change their position.
We also have rumors that Anthony Fauci was visiting CIA headquarters at this time as well. We're not sure if he's in the logbook or not. There are some accusations that he doesn't get logged in when he goes to the CIA. The whistleblower says that there was a dispute, and a dispute within an agency. They have a person called an ombudsman, and they asked that person to adjudicate this dispute, and he sided with the senior officers. And George Carlin says, for a conspiracy, it's not necessary that you have people in a room all rubbing their hands together. For a conspiracy to occur, all you have to have is that interests converge. And the interests that converge here is they all funded this research. They all knew about this research. Nobody told the public. Nobody warned us. A pandemic occurs, so everybody has a natural instinct to now hide the ball, hide the information. Don't let anybody know that this funding was out there and that you knew anything about it. One of the biggest clues we got that there was a cover-up was in 2018, there was a project called Diffuse, and it was proposed by the Wuhan lab, Ralph Barrick in North Carolina, and Peter Daszak, head of EcoHealth Alliance. They wanted to create a virus, a coronavirus, and put a special cleavage site in it called a furin cleavage site to make it more infectious to humans. Well, people, once they saw the sequence of COVID, they're like, wow, that looks just like what COVID is. And there hadn't been a virus like this in nature that had this special cleavage site right where it needed to be. And they're like, oh my goodness, there was a proposal for this. But none of the people associated with the proposal told us the only reason we found out about this, a whistleblower, a Lieutenant Colonel Marine in the Defense Department working in one of these agencies, came across it. And he didn't come across it easily. He looked for it thinking it might be there, and it was missing. The file was empty. And then there was more ramifications, and he said he saw me having an interaction with Fauci, and he went back to the file, and it appeared. And what he found was this proposal. Well, we just discovered about 3 weeks ago that this proposal to create a virus that looks just like COVID-19 was presented to 15 agencies. And so you scratch your head and you say, well, once COVID came out and they saw the sequence and they said, wow, I remember having a proposal about that 2 years ago, and it didn't get funded, but I think they wanted to create something that looks just like this. Wouldn't alarm bells have come off and you would have come forward and said to the country, I think I have some information here? Not one of these bureaucrats came forward. Some of these people, Christian Anderson's one of them, about 2 months later get a $9 million grant approved personally by Anthony Fauci, signed off by Anthony Fauci, $9 million. Most of these people have had millions of dollars. EcoHealth Alliance is to this day still getting more money. We think they probably worked with the lab that created this virus, and yet EcoHealth Alliance is still getting taxpayer money. They should be forever lifetime ban on getting any money. They should be dissolved as a corporation, and yet they're still getting our money.
With respect to the gain-of-function research, which creates new threats, biological threats that do not exist currently and might not naturally come into existence in a decade, a century, or a millennium, that research creates threats. And those threats are existentially risky threats. And that research is being conducted without a justifiable rationale. There is no rationale in terms of development of countermeasures. Industry develops vaccines and therapeutics against diseases currently in humans, not against diseases that don't yet exist and need to be made in a lab.
How important is it that we actually have a law passed and that we actually have regulators that are scientists, but that are outside of the supply of money, outside of the exchange of grant money?
I think it's a matter of survival. It's that important.
Anthony Fauci said, I am science. And when you criticize Anthony Fauci, you are criticizing science.
They're really criticizing science. because I represent science.
But science is never that way. Anybody who says that really isn't a scientist. Scientist is not really about consensus. It's about disputation. And it's about trying to prove your point. And it was Einstein who said, I'm always one experiment away from being disproven. Come up with an experiment, you disprove my hypothesis, you win. And that's the ongoing nature of science.
Do these bureaucrats and their ecosystem of nonprofits and scientific institutions, do they actually feel any accountability to you as a legislator or the American taxpayers that are funding it all?
No. I think most of them have resisted everything other than a court order. Almost all of the information has not been gotten voluntarily. They've all lawyered up, and only information we get is from Freedom of Information Act.
Who do these agencies answer to if not Congress?
I think the disturbing thing is no one. They should answer to us. Congress's job is to oversee these agencies, but they appear to answer to no one.
So people hearing you say that the U.S. government is still funding Peter Daszak and EcoHealth, then we probably know that he did gain-of-function research. Like, why? Like, how is that still happening?
It boggles the mind. I mean, it also goes to, though, when you point out something bad in government, you think it would change. We'll elect Republicans, then we'll elect Democrats. You're like, well, why doesn't anything ever change? You know, we have different branches of government. We have executive, legislative, and judicial, and there's supposed to be checks and balances on each other. But let's say I want documents from the president. I can't make him. That's what I want. I want documents from HHS and NIH on the deliberation of gain and function. They won't give it to me. How do I make them? This virus killed 0.3%. That isn't to downplay the deaths. 1 million Americans died either from or with COVID, and that's a lot of people. I know people who died from COVID, and yet 0.3% is nothing compared to 50% or 30%. We do know that they're doing research in foreign countries, but also in our country, with Ebola, with Nipah, with viruses that have a 50% mortality. If one of those gets out, we're talking about something so devastating that most people can't even imagine. I was saying this to someone the other day, that what would happen with 50%, and they said, no, 10% would devastate the world. Because think about it. What happens to sewage? What happens to potable water? What happens to the chlorination of the water? Can you imagine, what would happen? And in our big cities with people so close together, we would descend into utter chaos and anarchy, I think, within weeks. If something were killing off 50% of the people.